GD Vegas Fulcha, hello and welcome back to another episode of Craic on the Coast, the show where we celebrate Irish history, heritage, and culture here in New England and beyond. I'm your host, Michael Schilling, joined once again by my co-host, Shaun. Shaun, how you doing?
Not too bad, Michael. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. We've got a guest whose research opens up an entirely new way for us to look at Irish history, and one that connects with the tragedy of the Great Hunger directly to our own lives and our own health.
Yeah, and not usually, a lot of times we do bring the Craic, but we also like to bring a little bit of education and a little bit of perspective. And I'm excited and delighted to welcome Dr. Oonagh Walsh, professor at Glasgow University, whose research into epigenetics explores how trauma and just trauma in general, but also just the Irish famine in particular, has carried forward across generations, not just socially, but culturally and biologically. So it's a fascinating intersection of all those things.
Dr. Walsh, first, thank you for joining us. To get started, could you explain to our listeners what epigenetics is in simple terms, in very, very simple terms for our listeners, and how it applies to your work on the Great Hunger?
Well, first of all, can I say thank you very much for inviting me onto the podcast, and I'm delighted to be here. To be there in spirit rather than in person, looking out on a rather gloomy evening here in Cork, but really happy to be here. So I should say, obviously, I'm a historian and not a scientist, so I will give you the non-science version of epigenetics, which I probably for your listeners will be clearer than a scientist trying to explain it. Epigenetic change refers to changes in gene expression. So the first thing that we need to know is it does not change one's DNA. But if during pregnancy, and the impact is different depending on the stage of pregnancy, if the mother is exposed to certain stressors, so for example, severe nutritional deprivation or intense psychological stress, it can cause the developing fetus, the genes of that fetus, to express themselves in different ways once that child is born. It can have an impact on how the child develops in the early years of life. But what we have seen from big cohort studies, and where these awful environments have had an impact on pregnant women and their offspring, it can have long-term effects. So often biological, physiological, and psychological impacts that often don't find their full expression until that individual who was stressed as a fetus reaches full adulthood and sometimes late middle age. So it causes genes to be switched on or switched off. But the really important thing to know about epigenetics is it is a wonderful thing, because what it is doing is priming the fetus to enter a hostile environment. So it is priming that fetus. For example, if it has gestated during a period of food shortage, that fetus, once born, a little infant, and as it grows into childhood and adulthood, is primed to make maximum use of the calories that are available to it. So it is a protective mechanism. Equally, if the mother is under intense psychological stress, her body has high levels of the stress hormone cortisol, and that appears to prime that fetus to enter a hostile, dangerous environment. So that baby and that individual is being primed to cope with a stressful environment, to be on high alert, to be ready for signs of danger. So it is a protective mechanism. Where it tends to have ill effect is when the environment then changes and goes back to one in which food supplies are restored to normal levels. We live in a world which I think all of us are finding very stressful at the moment, but not as stressful as a famine situation or a situation of civil war or imprisonment, such as some mothers in the big cohort studies on epigenetics were exposed to. Mm. So epigenetics, as I say, it's a protective mechanism. It operates to switch genes on or off to best benefit the developing fetus once it is born, so that it is best protected in a stressful environment.
Okay. So for with regards to the perspective and the context we're going to discuss it in, many of us, we think of the famine, we think of immediate devastation, starvation, emigration, death. But this asks us to think about it in terms of an even longer perspective with regards to multi-generational, not just in that distinct moment.
I should say the big studies that have been done on this, the human studies, are the Dutch Hunger Winter and studies done on survivors of the Holocaust. But the Dutch Hunger Winter study is really the gold standard because, now forgive me if this is under the heading of teaching your grandmother to suck eggs, if everybody already knows a great deal about the Second World War, but for those who don't, in 1944, in October of 1944, the German occupying army in the Netherlands blockaded a significant portion of the Netherlands. They did this in retaliation for the order from the Dutch government, which was then in exile in London, issued instructions to Dutch citizens to refuse to cooperate with the occupying German army. So in retaliation, there was a blockade and a period of intense food shortage and obviously psychological strain occurred between October of 1944 and May of 1945. And what we find, that captive population, we have fantastic records in terms of the number of calories that were available, the makeup of the population in the occupied territory. So we know about how many were in different age groups, how many women were pregnant or fell pregnant during that period of starvation. We have controlled populations, siblings who were born before or after the famine. And the maternity hospitals in the occupied zones remained open. So they kept a very careful record of the course of pregnancy and then the size and the health of babies after delivery. And that cohort, and in May of 1945, the blockade obviously was lifted, the war was over, and normal food supplies were restored. So it's a very miserable, but a relatively brief period of starvation and strain. But it was the children born who were either in gestation when famine hit or were conceived when their mothers were starved, who were born during and after that period of starvation. They were followed up, and then their children and their grandchildren were also followed. So it's a very big cohort study with fantastic data. And what they found was immediately after when the war ended, the babies that were born during the period of starvation and immediately after were smaller in terms of their birth weight, which is what you would expect. But they appeared to recover. So they appeared to gain weight. They didn't seem to have significant cognitive impacts, certainly in the early years. But what is really interesting, and that's where there is an interesting model for Ireland, it's when that generation reached adulthood that they started to show quite a distinct health profile. So it is those survivors, those impacted individuals who showed a statistically significantly elevated rates of cardiovascular disease, respiratory problems, obesity in late middle age that was not linked to overeating. They were genetically primed. And from my perspective, I should say I'm a historian of mental health. I'm particularly interested in the establishment of the district asylums in Ireland in the 19th century. So for me, the real point of interest is the significantly elevated rates of substantive mental illnesses, particularly schizophrenia and schizophrenia affective disorders. So those rates are much higher in survivors of that relatively brief period of famine in the Netherlands. And when we look at the Irish profile, there is such a change in Ireland in terms of general health profiles pre and post famine. So, for example, diabetes is unknown in pre-famine Ireland. But when the generation that survived the famine, and obviously the Irish famine is a much longer period of starvation and stress, when those individuals reach adulthood, they start to enter the Irish district asylum system in hugely elevated numbers. We also see type 1 diabetes appearing as a marked feature in the Irish health profile. And as those individuals reach adulthood and middle age, again, the same problems with respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular disease. And it is a very close profile to what we see in the Dutch population, those people who endured the Dutch hunger winter. And the same kind of findings are exhibited in follow-up studies done on Holocaust survivors and their children in Israel and in the United States.
So with regards to that, Oonagh, one of the things that I would say to give context to people with regards to, like you said, the Irish profile, one statistic that I think is pretty common knowledge is the fact that pre-famine, the Irish were one of the tallest Europeans. And then post-famine, there's obviously a definite change with that. So what you're saying is that would have been, like you said, a protective gene.
Well, funny enough, Michael, that specific thing, that obviously epigenetic change it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. But it doesn't, if you expose a population, like for example in the Netherlands or in Ireland or in the concentration camps, about a third of the people who endure that strain and their children are not affected. So it's not, this is not a uniform sort of human response, and it's still unclear as to why some people appear to have a very direct and immediate response and others appear to be, well, I wouldn't say unscathed. I don't think anybody lives through a famine or a period of imprisonment unscathed, but they certainly don't have that kind of gene expression. It's interesting that you mentioned the difference in height, because of course what happens in post-famine Ireland, and I think this is another really interesting potential research area that I would love to get into with a friendly nutritionist. The Irish diet, of course, shifts dramatically, and you get a peasant population that were healthy on potatoes and buttermilk, supplied pretty much all of the nutritional needs that a human has. And the Irish, like the Scots, who get the same kind of benefit from oatmeal, were taller. That's why they were so heavily recruited by the British Army. And in the post-famine years, you get the emergence of a whole series of chronic illnesses. But the Irish diet shifts from potato-based diet to wheat-based diet, and in particular, especially towards the end of the century, nasty, all the stuff that nutritionists tell us is awful, cheap white bread. Irish migration to Scotland, I have an interest in obstetrics, and Scottish obstetricians who served Irish migrants, women who had their multiple babies in Scotland, they bemoaned what they called the bread and tea diet. So the Irish diet becomes much poorer in the post-famine years, ironically, as a wider range of foods become available generally, particularly when the Irish migrate. But the diet that the Irish depend upon is almost exclusively wheat-based, where it had been potato-based and really lacking in vitamins and nutrients. And I think another fascinating thing about the post-famine, which may be why the Irish get smaller and more bow-legged and more exposed to a range of chronic illnesses. But well, let me ask you a little question. Do you know who has the highest rate of celiac disease in the world?
Ooh, I'll defer to you, Shaun, on that question.
I mean, I'm an historian. I'm not going to yell the answer to that in any way. But you have a stump, Oonagh. Go for it.
Okay, well, I'll tell you, it's not who you might expect. It's the Italians. Despite all their beautiful pasta, the Italians have the highest rate of celiac disease in the world, but the Irish have the second highest. And I will say this to your listeners, I'm not putting this forward as an intensely researched point, but I think it is that shift in Ireland from potatoes to wheat. You suddenly get this explosion of celiac disease, and it is we have the second highest rate in the world. So, as I say, I say that entirely as a non-scientist, but there's a lot going on in post-famine Ireland in terms of diet and the access to food that the Irish have at home and abroad. I think there is a literal shock to the system. And of course, celiac disease, for those of you who don't know anything about it, it is an intolerance, an inability to process gluten, which is in wheat, and it causes diarrhea, an inability to absorb nutrients. And I think that's why the Irish are smaller and more bow-legged. Well, I mean, that's partly to do with rickets, because when they move to industrial cities, there's no access to sunlight and vitamin D. So there's a whole lot of change. I mean, as you all know, the second half of the 19th century sees everything overturned in Ireland. The rise of the Catholic Church, changes in marriage patterns, changes in inheritance patterns, outward migration, and all of these elements together. I mean, I think the outward migration is another stressor that ensures that epigenetic change is a real feature of the Irish population. The stress of the famine and the starvation is done, but I think there is an intense psychological pressure that accompanies migration for many of the people who leave the country. And that tends to, I think, underpin a continued epigenetic change. The Irish are a very stressed, I mean, it's gas, Ireland has such a reputation. Everybody's so easygoing and jovial and jolly and all that sort of stuff. But by God, for quite a long time, the poor old Irish were exposed to a substantive degree of stress that wasn't just famine related. The famine precipitates it, but I think it continues for a very long period of time. Huge impact, obviously, on particular classes and categories of migrants, and the poorer you are, the more stressed you are. But there's a lot of factors, and there's a big change in the Irish diet, and I think that helps to explain other elements of poor health in Ireland in the post-famine years. But yeah, celiac disease. So every poor people are scuppered to death, if you'll pardon me.
No. I was just saying, so comparatively, like what you've just described and the impact it had on Ireland, like, do you see that in other areas with like war, genocides that take place? Are there key biological markers that exist, which you described somewhat, but in communities today that are being looked at?
Well, look, I don't think we have to stretch our imaginations too broadly to think that what is happening in Gaza is going to have significant long-term impacts. I was thinking about this the other day, and obviously all of the elements that led to epigenetic change, with a degree of irony, to the survivors of the Holocaust, to the Dutch hunger winter survivors, to the Irish famine, to the Indian famines of the late 19th century, and there's huge rates of starvation and food shortages in China in the 1950s as a consequence of Chairman Mao's Great Leap. So all of those populations show signs of epigenetic change and an attempted adaptation to stressful environments. And sorry, Shaun, I forgot what was the precipitating question. Can you remind me?
No, it's just like, so what you've seen in the work you've been doing, are you seeing that, or do you know of studies that are going on that are trying to track that today? So obviously the situation in Gaza will be one down the line to be looked at, but in Rwanda, Ethiopia, and
I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is an area that is absolutely ripe for the awful thing when you're thinking about these sorts of impacts. I would say there is hardly a country in the world that couldn't point to its own moment of crisis where epigenetic change may well have happened. But a lot of those studies have not been done. So there's some very early work coming out of India. There's been some interesting work on the Chinese famines, but the big problem there is because of Mao's decrees, remote villages in China reported much higher harvests and yields because they were terrified of the wrath that would descend upon them if they dared to say this is not working and the populations are starving. So the data in China is less reliable. I think one of the areas is, say, India is just beginning to publish work in this field, and that would be a fantastic comparator for Ireland, because you've got a similar, colonial regime, excellent records, and of course the big advantage for people who are not native speakers is an awful lot of this body of records from the British colonial period are in English. So those studies are beginning to emerge. There's work being done on the Greek famine, because the occupation of the Greek islands by the Germans in the Second World War saw mass starvation, and again, the kind of strain that we see in Holland and in Ireland. So there's not a huge body of material on that yet, but again, that's a part of the world where there is a focus. But yeah, as you say, Rwanda, Gaza, there's a very interesting study, and again, it's a good cohort study, and the records are really good. One of the few studies that I have looked at that didn't involve a man-made famine, but there's a part of the Swedish archipelago, and please forgive my mangling this. I always feel like the chef from the Muppets when I try to say Uverkalix. I'm sure it sounds very different said by a native Swede, but there was a remote part in the north of Sweden, a series of islands that underwent periodic feast and famine, quite literally. So a series of failed harvests followed then by abundance. So and quite a small population. So it made for an excellent study, and again followed over successive generations, people who remained in Sweden and those who migrated to other parts of Scandinavia. Again, showing a similar profile to the Irish, to the Dutch, to Holocaust survivors. So there is the problem with Ireland, of course, is the famine happened, 1845 to 1852. We do not have the tissue samples. We don't have the live specimens. We don't have the same body of records that the Dutch Hunger Winter has, that the Swedish cohort study has, and that Holocaust survivors have. So we lack. What we're looking at in Ireland is making comparisons with other very robust epidemiological and big data studies, and seeing how Ireland maps onto those findings. And so far, Ireland maps very closely onto the findings that we see, say the Dutch Hunger Winter in particular.
Now, one question I would have is, and you brought this up with regards to your background in mental health. Obviously, you have a situation where people are deprived nutrition, and there are biological markers associated with that. Are the biological markers that would be associated with basically post-traumatic stress syndrome from undergoing not just the situation of the famine, but then you have just the colonialism in general, War of Independence. And you said as well, and not any culture or not any people would be devoid of this. Post-traumatic stress is something that it's newer with regards to research, but it's the same topic. Oh,
absolutely. What we can say is the Irish. Now, again, I don't want to make a statement and then immediately backpedal and say, of course, there are a whole series of other factors, but of course there are. When we look at the Irish mental health profile, it is very startling if we compare the pre and post-famine years. So the Irish have an extraordinarily high level of asylum and then mental hospital usage. We are the highest in the world. We beat Russia, and Russia, of course, used the psychiatric system for non-medical reasons. But we proportionately have a higher mental hospital usage than the Russians did, proportionate to our population. And the situation in Ireland in relation to mental health is even more dramatic because, of course, as you and all your listeners will know, in 1845, the population is 8.2 million. In 1900, it's 4.4. So we have a population that's halved. But we have an asylum admission system that has absolutely skyrocketed. When I come from Ballinasloe in County Galway, it's the home of the Connaught District Lunatic Asylum, one of the first and most important of the Irish district asylums. It begins with provision for 150 beds in 1833. It's widely mocked. Everybody's saying there's not 133 lunatics in the whole of the country, never mind in Connaught alone. This is going to be a great big empty white elephant, that the government is paying for. Lo and behold, it starts to fill very rapidly. And it has a history of overcrowding that becomes particularly acute in the second half of the 19th century as people flood in. Now, it's partly to do with the legislation that governs admission to Irish district asylums, but it is also, even if we subtract the cultural and political and economic reasons that may have encouraged people to use these institutions, we nonetheless are left with a situation where we have very high rates of mental illness in the post-famine years that we see in our population at home and amongst Irish migrants abroad. Now, you could say perhaps the Irish are used to institutional care. I do think that there's a very interesting parallel between the mental health system, that process of being admitted to an institution. And if you want to get out of it, there are certain steps that you have to follow. And they actually, I think, map very closely onto Catholic religious practice. So you must acknowledge to the physician in the asylum that you have been ill, that you've recognized that you were ill, rather like confessing your sins to the priest, that yes, I have sinned, I did something wrong. And then they absolve you. And it is the asylum physician who listens to this kind of confession, who evaluates the patient's mental state and then says, okay, you're cured, you can leave. So the Irish, we're kind of comfortable, in a sense, with the process that takes place within the asylum system. So we may use it for those reasons. We also have a series of strategic uses of the asylum that tends to increase numbers. Some of the saddest, which may be of interest to your listeners in Boston, is what I call the gone to America cases. So under Irish, and I realize I'm getting away from epigenetics here, so just do feel free to stop me if I'm...
Oh, no. This is...
if I'm meandering.
Yeah, no, it's a conversation. Well, it'll go wherever it goes. So
the legislation that governed admission to Irish asylums, you could apply for admission, to say, I'm ill or my relative is ill and I want to enter for treatment. That's a very small minority of the cases that enter the district asylums. The vast majority of patients, particularly in the west of Ireland, and particularly for men, come under a piece of legislation called the Dangerous Lunatics Act. So mental ill health in Ireland is framed within a carceral and public safety sort of environment. So any individual could be accused of being a dangerous lunatic. If that accusation was made, the individual is brought before two justices of the peace who have no medical training, and they say yay or nay, and they almost always say yay. That individual is then brought to jail under the early operation of the Act, and from the jail transferred to the asylum. And the asylum has no power to refuse anybody brought under the Dangerous Lunatics Act, so they have to accept somebody in, even if, as you find in Ireland, because the constabulary that accompany the person to the asylum are local, as are most of the nurses, and you very often get an interesting dialogue in the records where the constabulary will say, this person isn't insane, this is a dispute over a farm or over marriage, and somebody's triggered the act to get this person out of the way quickly. But what you find, as again, I'm sure all you and your listeners will know, towards the end of the 19th century, America starts to clamp down on inward migration. That's why we get the screening at Ellis Island. So you get a greater degree of scrutiny and in terms of the people who are seeking to enter the United States. And as you know, ship's captains were required to report anybody whom they believed to be ill, mentally or physically ill on the voyage over. They ran the risk of losing their license if they didn't report these people. And if you were ill, you ran the risk of not just you being returned home to Ireland, but your whole family. And of course, the expense of getting across to the United States from Ireland was so huge. This was an enormous last hope investment for many families. So what I see in the Ballinasloe records are individuals who are not mentally ill necessarily, but who are, as people used to say when I was growing up, who were touched, who were a little odd, who had peculiarities of behaviour. They were not dangerous and they were not insane. But the families fear that if they bring this relative, a brother, sister, son, daughter, along with them on the family migration, they may all be turned back at Ellis Island or at whatever port of entry. So what they do is they trigger the act. They make an accusation of dangerous lunacy against this family member. That person is arrested, off they go to the asylum, and then the family leave and they go to America.
Oh, wow.
And we know this, well, at least I know this, I've seen this in the records. It breaks my heart each time I see. When a patient was admitted, they were observed, obviously, by the medical staff, by the nurses and the asylum physician. if they were deemed to have recovered or to have been a wrongful admission, in other words, they were never insane, so they shouldn't have been brought in, a letter is sent to the address of the person who committed that person, because you have to be committed by an individual. And you can see these letters because they have the asylum crest on the back, which means they return to the asylum when they can't be delivered. And you'll see two, maybe three addresses, first one scored out, as it follows the family up to Dublin, to the first leg of their migration, and eventually gone to America is written across the front, and it's returned to the asylum. Now, I don't believe, since we're talking about trauma, I don't believe that any family does this merrily and happily and thinks, fantastic, we have got rid of Shaun or Mary or Bridget or Tomas or whoever it might be. I think there is a huge burden of awful guilt. But they fear that if they take that person with them, they won't get into America and they can't come home. They'll have given up their tenancy. They'll have invested everything that they can in a ticket across to the United States. And I suspect there's an awful trauma. You know, you mentioned PTSD. I think that is a very specific type of PTSD. I suspect the family that settle in America never speak of that person again, because just the awful sense of knowing that they have had to leave them behind, I think, is horrific. And those individuals tend never to leave the asylum because you had to be discharged into somebody's care. And if you don't have any relatives left, then there is nobody to take care of you. So it is often those people who are not mentally ill, they're not insane, they shouldn't be there, but there's nowhere else for them to go. And I had one man who spent 44 years in the asylum.
Wow.
So there are so many trauma-related stories. I mean, this will apply to any country that has a history of outward migration, but of course, in the Irish case, we do have it being precipitated by a particularly traumatic event. And I think that trauma in different ways finds its expression in epigenetic change, in this attempted response, a biological response to protect that individual. But I think it is a trauma that sort of gets topped up in different ways by a continuing outward migration that isn't necessarily, I've worked in Scotland for most of my career and will say it has not been a traumatic movement. But of course, that's very different from somebody who in 1880 is standing in the wilds of Mayo thinking, I could stay, but I have no prospects here. And of course, with a change from the division of tenancies amongst sons and daughters to the English system of primogeniture, do I want to be a spinster sister minding the hens and raising other people's children with no dowry and no prospect of marriage? Do I want to be a bachelor uncle who will never come into a farm or a tenancy in my own right? I could do that, or I could emigrate, but it's not necessarily a positive decision, thinking, right, well, things aren't bad here, but, I'll take my chances. And so there's a different context for Irish migration. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a forced migration, but it is one that has a trauma.
Sure.
It does.
I mean, one thing that we always talk about during our, commemorations that we have that are hunger and immigration related is the idea that a lot of times we describe it as, oh, they were coming for the dream of America, and you wrap it around like a positive spin.
Yeah.
Where in reality it's out of desperation. It's you either knew you were going to die there or you didn't know where you were going to end up if you left.
Well, you see, I did this. I mean, again, I wouldn't want to say, Oonagh was a Cono, nobody had it as bad as us. As I don't think in the 19th century migration to America, from across Europe was a difficult, long journey. I mean, it is really interesting to contrast, though, I suppose, Irish migration patterns with those of Italians, who would culturally be somewhat similar, Catholic, large familied, and a family, the primary unit, but to see the rates at which Italians retire back to Italy relative to the Irish going far and never coming home. Again, I think that is something to do with the trauma and feeling that people had to leave, as you say, it would be lovely to think that everybody who got on board did so positively, thinking, I'm off to the land of opportunity. But, I think it wasn't as straightforward as that.
No.
And that trauma, I think, is carried for not just one generation. I think it does have an impact on successive generations.
So within that, the impact on generations coming after, are there patterns that we can see in our families? Whether it be my family in the north of Ireland, or Mike's Irish American family, are there certain things with regards to health conditions or even attitudes around food, security, high anxiety levels, depression, that are connected to that inherited trauma? Or have I just checked
Shaun,
them all off along the way?
You've listed them all. I need to say no more.
Well,
no, absolutely.
You say that, Oonagh, but I think to myself, on my father's side of the family, his mother was Italian, and they immigrated through Ellis Island. And I remember, her being 85 years old, and when we went and visited, you never left anything on the plate because they lived through the Depression. And so they knew what it was like to not have as much as you could have. So you never left anything on the plate. You had to eat it all.
Absolutely. Oh, no, I think, I've said it'd be interesting to look at Italy and Ireland, but also Italian, with the emphasis on food and family and feeding, Italy, Ireland, and the Jewish communities. Again, they are three that have had, in their own ways, traumatic kinds of passages to the United States. But it's the same characteristic. Well, I think the attitude of mothers, it is regarded, I think, in those three cultures as being a source of shame if you visit somebody's house and they don't feed you until you can barely fit yourself back out the door again. That there's a saying in Scotland that some of the Scots, a very beautiful and lovely and hospitable and extraordinarily generous people, but Edinburgh is regarded as being that little bit kind of snooty anyway. So there's a saying in Edinburgh that if you call to someone's house, you used to hear, you'll have had your tea. In other words, you fend for yourself. Whereas the second you go into a traditional Italian, Jewish, Irish house, I'm sure your listeners are all familiar with Father Ted. It's the Mrs. Doyle syndrome. Have a cup of tea, I'll go on. Just cook and a sandwich. They're diagonal. But there is this urgency. You'd never have somebody in your house and not offer to feed them and ideally press food on them as they go out the door. And I think it is that history of having, endured shortage, starvation or food shortage or food, I can never pronounce it, precariosity, i.e. a precarious state. But, when there's an uncertain supply of food, there is a sense of it is important to eat and nourish and feed. It is also a way of binding communities together, which, of course, all migrants need when they head to a new world. The idea that you can fit into Little Italy or Chinatown or, wherever with people who understand you, who have the same kinds of practices, who eat the same food. It was an absolutely vital survival mechanism. Mm. But, there are issues around food and its consumption and the type of food that the Irish eat. And I think that is absolutely a famine legacy, this uncertainty about, I can't begin to imagine the terror that people must have felt during the famine each year. As you know, there had been crop failures in the past. It's just the blight is so devastating, and it's the awful lumper potato that's particularly susceptible. The terror for families who struggle through, say, the first awful September 1845 and seeing the crop fail and thinking, well, it'll probably be all right in the spring, and then more failure. And then your hopes slightly raised where there's a survival of the crop in certain parts of the country, Black 47. That strain and wondering how you could keep people alive must have been so intense that it's no wonder it does cause, whatever mechanism it occurs by, but that epigenetic change is an absolutely vital response to try and protect those populations in the future and successive generations. But I think it's very difficult sometimes to unpack what is a biological response and what is a psychological response, because we are sufficiently distant from the famine now for it not necessarily to be a folk memory. And in any case, my God, people are so awful about history. I can barely tell you what happened yesterday, never mind what happened in 1845. But we don't necessarily have that direct link. But what we do still see, particularly in Ireland, is an almost, too strong to say it's instinctive, but certainly a cultural response to disaster. The Irish, and please forgive me, this is not the sound of me burnishing the national trumpet, but it is certainly true. You can see it in statistics that when a natural disaster occurs, be that a famine, civil war with the aftermath of displaced populations, the Irish disproportionately give much more generously to those disasters than any other country, and that is a direct consequence of the Great Famine, a positive consequence. I was nearly brought to tears in the COVID pandemic. I'm sure you're aware of this, but it was very touching that obviously certain populations were hit much more severely, and the Native American population suffered terribly badly in the early days of COVID, where a lot of tribes were left to their own resources. And a young woman began a fundraising campaign so that they could get food to scattered Native American populations. And she noticed that a huge number of donations were coming from Ireland. And they all said, it's our turn. This is our way of saying thank you. Lo and behold, it was that folk memory, a hugely important one, of the Choctaw and other tribes that had been displaced onto reservations who had walked the Trail of Tears. And an English agent who told these populations there was a famine in Ireland and people were starving. And out of no resources, they scraped together, as you know, $200 and had it sent over. And that, I'm really bad at maths, 160 years later, 170 years later, that memory remained. And there's a very beautiful, for your listeners, if you haven't been there, if you're across in East Cork, there's a very beautiful sculpture of eagle feathers in Mitchelstown. No, not Mitchelstown. The whiskey place, the Jameson Jakers. Anyway.
Yeah. I'm sure our listeners can't find it, and they would be. I mean, that relationship, when you first said that was the relationship that first came to mind. We've had great opportunities to be at conferences where they've talked exclusively on the Choctaw-Irish relationship and how, like you said, 170 years later, it's still there. We had, who was it, Shaun? The CEO from Ireland Lacrosse on a previous episode, and just still the bond that exists just for the sole purpose of having charity, even when you didn't have much to send over. It is amazing how the Irish respond to those situations.
It's people who couldn't, if you pinned them down, couldn't tell you exactly when the famine occurred or how many people died or whatever. It is still there. It is still a part of an Irish consciousness and a response. And God, I hope it lasts for a very long time, because we could do with some kindness in the world at the minute. But yeah. Maybe that's an epigenetic change. Maybe our brains have all been rewired. Well, no, actually, that's not entirely true, because at the minute we are just starting the month-long campaign for our new president, or the presidential race is on. And we've had a couple of unsavories who attempted to put themselves forward, so we are not... we're not as nice as we might be in some ways.
There's hope, we'll just say.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. But, yeah.
So, obviously a big part of this, and just to touch on, you're talking about, we're so far removed from the famine. We're not that stage anymore where we can look at, survivors or, like all that, etc. So what role do you see for projects like the National Famine Way or commemorations that we even have here, the Brig St. John out in Massachusetts, to keep history alive and not just be a memory, just something that happened, coming up on 200 years ago, but something that's a part of ongoing research, awareness, both, scientifically, culturally, and so on.
Yeah. I think things like this, your podcasts, that make people think. The thing that I do find interesting about any time that I've spoken about epigenetics is people make a very direct and personal link to it. Sometimes the Americans make the best jokes about it, because the number of people. I did a talk that I'm useless with technology. Anyway, wound up on TikTok, 2.5 million views, and the comments, which I didn't want to look at because I thought the internet is a horrible place. So my daughter screened them because she has TikTok and I don't. But anyway, the number of Americans who said, "I knew it wasn't my fault, I'm fat." And it's what it's meant. And then I've been contacted by so many people who say, "Look, this actually helps me to make sense of my family profile. We have a long history of significant mental illness. We have the kind of things that you have been talking about, the sort of expressions that we see in people's lives. That's my family profile." And that, I think, is what helps people to develop a historical consciousness. So we don't just live in the moment. We are the inheritors of long traditions, some positive, some negative. We may well also, many of us, carry markers and changes, biological changes, that was a response on the part of our forebears to moments of acute stress. And as I say, it means for a lot of people, history is now a way of making sense of themselves in the present, or understanding difficult relationships that they may have had with parents or grandparents. Or you see this a lot in, these first studies before the Dutch hunger winter findings began to be published. There was an immediate focus, understandably, on survivors of the Holocaust and how they fared. Would they marry? Could they bear to bring children into a world in which the most awful things had happened? And lo and behold, the majority who survived did marry. The majority went on to have children. But it was seen very quickly that a lot of these, the new generation, suffered from, again, elevated rates of attention deficit disorder, as we would call it now, or were excessively anxious in response to sort of ordinary stressors in life. And it was presumed for quite a while that this was a consequence of having been born to very anxious parents. So parents who had lived through the camps, who had attempted to make a new life for themselves, were understandably either hugely protective of their children because they feared some awful catastrophe might land upon them again, or they were very distanced from their children. They couldn't bring themselves to love their children in case another awful event happened and their children were lost to them. So there was a sort of a self-protective barrier put up between parents and children. Now it appears that these manifestations, these difficulties, are epigenetic change. So we see it in those populations where there is a biological transmission, because when you control for all sorts of other environmental factors and personalities, you get this persistent profile. It manifests itself to a significant degree. We see this very much in the Irish population in mental ill health, but there are also physical effects too. So it's not, again, it's enormously complicated. Perhaps somebody who emigrates from Galway or Mayo or Cork and is stressed finds it difficult to establish an ordinary relationship with their children. There may well be those sorts of impacts, but as I say, when we map the Irish profile against the Dutch and the Holocaust and the Swedish populations, we see similar profiles.
That's fascinating.
We're all effed, pardon my French.
That has probably been the most straightforward comment we've had on this podcast so far. Yeah. That was great.
I mean, I am so relieved I didn't know any of this. I have 2 children now, young adults. I'm so relieved I didn't know any of this when I was pregnant. Because honestly, I'd have just sit in a room and not look at anything, not think about anything, not do anything for fear that I would be damaging them. I mean, I suppose in one way it shows us how resilient humans are.
Sure.
That we can have people who go through the most horrific traumas, who survive, who may well pass an inheritance or a legacy onto their children, but nonetheless, generation after generation, we endure. And of course, the thing is that where we tend to see the worst of these problems is where the environment reverts to normality. Mm. But I was thinking about Gaza the other day, and I was also thinking about some of the parts of Africa where there have been consistent civil upheaval, famines, attacks, child soldiers. In other words, where you have successive generations born into steadily stressful environments with food shortages, with intense psychological strain. Those individuals may well be relatively well adapted for that awful environment. That when epigenetic change is taking place under those conditions and the negative conditions persist, those individuals, that may be why they are surviving, because that's what they're primed for. The problem is when you take somebody who has undergone epigenetic change and you place them in a normal environment. We see this, there's been some interesting studies done on the Twin Tower attacks. There were about 3,000 births in the months after after September the 11th. Scientists are so ruthless. When the attacks occurred, in addition to a huge mobilization to treat the injured, and as you know, unfortunately, there were actually few injured survivors, but pregnant women who presented themselves for medical care at various different stages of pregnancy, saliva samples were taken and their cortisol levels were tested. And the children who were born, so women who were pregnant during those attacks, were followed up, their children were followed up. And those children, about 2/3 of that population, are showing up with, initially much higher rates of attention deficit disorders and difficulties adjusting to school, and now in adulthood are starting to present with significant mental illness. So even a traumatic event, which is very short in duration, and which, when the attacks were over, there wasn't an ongoing strain as you get in all of the other contexts that we have discussed, nonetheless are showing evidence of epigenetic change.
Wow.
So it's just going to be very interesting, and I wish them all well, but it's going to be very interesting to see how that population fares, into middle age, into old age, what their children, what impacts, if any, those children exhibit.
Well, I will say, to kind of start ending the discussion, I just to maybe bring it back to a little bit, I won't call it positive, because there's a lot of this that, but at least the research and the knowledge that's being garnered, it gives people an avenue to make, like you said, understand what.
And it may, it's changing positively, but there is, in some cultures, in some parts of different countries, a stigma associated with mental illness. And I think for some people, there's a relief in thinking, even though that should never be the case, but that people can say, no, it's not my fault. I can begin to unpack difficult relationships, or get to grips with either my own mental ill health or that of my parents or grandparents. If I can understand the context from which it comes, it seems less terrifying and more human. It doesn't explain, obviously, all forms of mental illness, but certainly in the Irish case, there's a profile around schizophrenia and schizophrenia affective disorders that I would say some of that is linked to the trauma of the famine. So, and understanding that maybe can make people more accepting kinder.
Yeah,
And it's not to apportion blame, but to help people to understand.
definitely. Now, for listeners that would be looking for more information on the topic, and just whether it's through papers that you've written or maybe there's good resources for people to look into and educate themselves further on it, what would your recommendations be?
Well, I would say now, if people do a quick Google, you get a lot of popular science that focuses on this area. So for non-scientists, that is probably a good way to start. I remember one of the first pieces that I read was, oh my gosh, I think it was Scientific American, something like that. But anyway, it was a piece called "Genes Are Not Destiny." Because this is the thing. You don't want to make this sound like it's an absolute curse. If you go through a trauma, you are going to have this negative result. But there are fantastic papers published on the Dutch hunger winter. So I would begin with that as a good way of understanding what this process is and how it has manifested itself. I say there's a number of really interesting studies done on Holocaust survivors. One thing that I'm looking at now, which I'm working on a paper at the moment on starvation and its impact on the brain, because I am arguing if I ever finish this article, which I need to be doing very soon, the current treatment of anorexia nervosa is based to a significant degree on a fascinating study done in America right at the tail end of the Second World War called the Minnesota Starvation Study. We can't, it's very difficult to do a human study of epigenetic change because obviously, ethically, you would never get permission to starve a population. But what we do have is the Minnesota Starvation Study. And this occurred, or it began in 1944. Everybody knew that there was mass starvation in Europe, and regardless of what people said, there was knowledge of the camps. So there was a growing awareness in the United States that what was going to be faced when the war ended was starving populations across Europe that would require to be refed. So a scientist called Ansel Keys in Minnesota proposed a study in which he would take healthy young men, volunteers, and starve them and then refeed them so that he could see what was the most effective way to restore a deprived population to health. And the men who volunteered were almost all conscientious objectors, and they were men who wanted to do something for the war effort, but their consciences wouldn't allow them to enlist in the army and kill people. So it's quite a long study. It is fantastic and fascinating, and it may be of interest to your listeners because it is an American study, absolutely unique. So the goal was that each of these young men who were fit and healthy, they go through a very intense screening before they were accepted onto the program. It's 130 odd men who take part in it, and they were starved. They were fed. They were under supervision. They lived on the campus in Minnesota, but they had to lose 25% of their body weight, and then they were to be refed. And what was really interesting was to see, from my perspective, because I'm interested in mental health, the psychological impact that starvation had upon these men. Unlike the Great Famine, the Holocaust, the Chinese famine, they were safe. They had voluntarily agreed to take part in this study. They knew that it was going to end. They knew that they could withdraw from the study if they wished. But what was really interesting was to see how they behaved, and they behaved in ways that absolutely mirrored people who had endured forced starvation in Ireland, in Poland, in China.
Wow.
And so what I am trying to put together, which is a development from the stuff that I have done on epigenetics, is so this study has become an important study in terms of the treating of anorexia nervosa nowadays. And an awful lot of sufferers find the Minnesota Starvation Study very encouraging because the men who suffer greatly for the benefit of others, they all recovered. Now, they're very carefully monitored, and the refeeding process is really interesting. But it's a really valuable piece of work because these men were so intensively studied. But what I'm interested in is, it's often said as if it was a criticism or a fair criticism that, as you know, in Ireland during the famine, food exports rise. So all sorts of food is leaving the country while the population is starving. And, there's a great deal of debate about, about the topic. But one question which does come up is, why didn't the starving Irish simply seize this food?
Yeah, that is a question that's brought up a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying that this is the answer, but what I'm trying to explore in this article is, and we see this in the Minnesota study, is that when an individual is starved, the body obviously prioritizes certain organs for survival. So the heart and the lungs, we lose fat, we lose muscle mass. But one of the first impacts on the brain is on cognitive function, on the ability to think rationally, to plan, to organize. The body goes into a survival mode. Again, we see this in testimony from the Holocaust. People are obsessed with food, obviously, but they hunt for food. But they seem to struggle with planning. So what I am wondering, and when we map it onto the Holocaust, again, there's uprisings in the Warsaw Ghetto, there is a Jewish resistance, but the number of people who are slaughtered in the camps, again, there's a critique by members of the Jewish resistance who say, who said at the time, why didn't they all rise up? They were going to be killed anyway. Why didn't they seize food? Why didn't they kill the guards? Well, what I'm wondering is if they simply were not capable because their brains have been starved, their cognitive function is so impaired that they seek food, but they lack the capacity to organise and plan. When we look at Ireland, there is a rebellion in 1848, but it is planned and led by the very well-nourished young Irelanders who were not subject to the nutritional deprivation that the peasant population were. So for me, the kind of that's what I'm doing at the moment is looking at food shortages, at starvation. I suppose it's where I sit is in that interdisciplinary space of what can science tell us about history and how can history inform what we understand about the modern world and about these awful moments of crisis, of man-made and naturally occurring famines. So for your listeners, I would say, look at the Dutch hunger winter, look at the Holocaust studies, at the Swedish studies. Ireland, it's still at very early stages, and as I say, it's the conclusions that we can draw about epigenetic change and the Great Famine are based upon these other studies. That's why I'd recommend you begin with those and then think, right, how does this map onto Ireland? And then for me, what I'm interested in looking at is what are other impacts that help us to explain things in the famine. Ireland is a small island. We have this horrendous moment of starvation. Population, much of it was coastal. The Irish seas are teeming with fish. The rock pools are full of limpets and marine life, and yet the west coast, the western seaboard, is where the famine hits worst. There are so still, despite all the scholarship on the famine, there are so many unanswered questions. But I'm only starting with one at the minute, which is, why not seize these? Okay, they're under armed escort, the food that is being brought to the ports for export, but nonetheless, geez, it wouldn't be beyond the limits of anybody's imagination to organise a small ambush and seize a truck full of all of the goods that are exported, the butter, corn,
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, what I always love to say is knowledge is power, and knowing history and being able to give a perspective and then look into little tidbits like you're talking about, all it does is just whether or not we use those tools as we were talking about prior to recording, at least it creates them, and hopefully we don't repeat past transgressions.
Yeah, I hope you're right.
Well, Dr. Walsh, I just want to thank you for sharing your time and insights with us today. It's always eye-opening to have these discussions that, like you said, there's so many different facets of the Great Hunger and its impact. And as you're saying, the events that the little intricate events that occurred within it as well. So thank you so much for coming on today. This was great.
It was a great pleasure. Lovely to meet you both.
Well, thank you.
Great meeting you. Thank you so much.
Before we sign off, just a little bit of housekeeping for our listeners. On Saturday, October 4th, the podcast will be on its second location recording, which will be at the Worcester Irish Cultural Festival at Polo Park in Worcester, Mass. Come by, say hello. We should have some fantastic guests. And then for people that are interested in just more information with regards to the Great Hunger and immigration and everything that comes with it, the next day on Sunday, October 5th, is our annual Brig St. John commemoration in Cohasset, remembering the tragic 1849 shipwreck that claimed the lives of immigrants fleeing the famine. This year's program, we're featuring Amy Elizabeth Day, writer and composer of the Irish folk musical In the Midst of Plenty, who was going to present her work on the musical, and we're going to have performances by students from the Berkeley Conservatory for a couple of the numbers, so it should be a great weekend.
Yep, absolutely. 2 powerful days that honor not only our past, but celebrate our living culture. So make sure you mark your calendars.
Yeah. Again, thank you, Dr. Walsh. Thank you, Shaun. And that's it for this episode of Craic on the Coast. If you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe, leave a review, share it with a friend. And if you have a topic you want us to talk about or a story to tell, you can email us over at craiconthecoast@gmail.com. That's CRAIC on the coast @gmail.com. And until next time, slán go fóill.